The next intervention from classical psychodrama that I want to highlight is the role reversal. So the role reversal is really the kind of the key, the linchpin of a psychodrama enactment. It's one of the things that makes psychodrama different from other modalities that employ the empty chair or that employ role playing. In that in psychodrama, we don't just role play or talk to an empty chair, but we also facilitate the protagonist reversing roles with whoever was in the empty chair or whoever else was in the role play, to deepen their experience, to leave the role of themselves and see themselves through the eyes of somebody else, to access their spontaneity in other roles and expand their sense of self. So this is really the most important intervention in psychodrama, and it really helps the protagonist deepen their experience of the process, to tap into their spontaneity and creativity, to develop new perspectives, new integrative catharses and abreactive catharses, to develop new empathy for themselves, for others, for the situation, to deepen their awareness, and to provide closure that would be impossible without the role reversal. And so there's some important guidelines to consider for safely using role reversals, especially related to trauma-focused psychodrama. Role reversal is one of these interventions that you could hurt somebody with if you're not careful and don't have adequate training and supervision in psychodrama. Remember that role reversal is the third phase of child development. So we'd want to use doubling and mirroring and make sure that the protagonist is grounded and has established some safety before we use role reversal. Especially if you're unsure about the psychiatric stability or emotional stability of the protagonist, then I would really encourage you to first emphasize doubling and the mirror position before using any role reversal. Especially using role reversal with any antagonist roles or trauma-based roles. So you'd want to ensure that the protagonist and the rest of the group can first interact with a trauma-based role or an antagonist role in an adult ego state and from strength-based roles before you role reverse them and have them play the role of an antagonist or perpetrator or victim in the scene. Otherwise, you might re-traumatize the protagonist or the group. You might contribute to dissociation or defense mechanisms or regression in the protagonist, and they might get stuck in that role, and you might have difficulty getting them back out of that role, back to an adult ego state. This is why it's so important that you don't just role reverse someone immediately into a perpetrator role or a victim role or an inner child role or an antagonist role, that you first have them interact with that role from an adult ego state with support and with strength-based roles accompanying them. Instead of using a role player to play the role of a trauma-based role or perpetrator role, you might consider using an empty chair or an object instead. Or you might first use an empty chair or an object to concretize a trauma-based role before having somebody play that role. Using an empty chair or an object gives a lot less power to that role, and oftentimes in the case of trauma, the perpetrator or the antagonist in the scene has already taken enough power from the protagonist, and we don't want to contribute to that further. We don't want to help the protagonist or the group further internalize the perpetrator or the antagonist. We want to give them a sense of control and safety and renegotiating the power that the perpetrator took from them. And one way of doing that is that you don't give the perpetrator more of a voice than they already had. You use an empty chair to represent them or an object. And then you want to make sure if you have a role player play an antagonist role or a perpetrator role, that you really do adequate de-rolling after the psychodrama scene. So oftentimes the de-rolling just involves having a protagonist or a role player wipe off the role, like physically wipe it off, and then verbally approach the protagonist and verbally tell them, hey, I'm no longer your father from the psychodrama. I'm Scott, and I'm just a group member here. There's other ways of facilitating de-rolling. You could do it through concretization. Many times we'll use a scarf or fabric or a prop to represent when somebody's in the role, and then it becomes easier to take off that scarf or prop to symbolize de-rolling from the role. Another thing you could do is you could facilitate the role player that played a perpetrator role in the scene, put the role into an empty chair in front of the group, and to separate themselves from that role by telling the group how, as an individual, they're different from the role they played. You might say, hey, can you list 3 different ways that you're different from that angry, demanding father role that you played in the psychodrama today? So there's different ways of de-rolling, and you want to make sure you do adequate de-rolling, especially if somebody played the role of an antagonist or perpetrator in psychodrama.